Do you ever feel like you have to pick between being well-liked and being influential? A lot of women feel that way, but perhaps it is not a choice you have to make. Today's guest is Dr. Kate Mason, who wrote the excellent book, Powerfully Likeable. And during our conversation, she'll explain how you can be just that. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a four-time author, Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. Dr. Kate Mason, it is such an honor and privilege to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for meeting at what I would consider to be a really terrible hour in Sydney, Australia. So it's very kind of you to say yes to this.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure, Karin. Thank you so much for having me.
So I love your book, and I'm going to hold it up, even though our viewers and listeners can check it out themselves, but it's called Powerfully Likeable. I love the title, and it's interesting because I think about, as women, how we have these challenges related to the balance of being authoritative and yet still wanting people to like us. And there could be an argument made that, powerful and likable are diametrically opposed. What would you say to that? And why do we think that way?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I mean, it feels, I think, to many of us like they are the two options we can choose to inhabit, doesn't it? You know, we can choose Miranda Priestley, high authority, no friends, or we can choose likable.
Not my bag, yes.
Right, not mine either. We can choose likable, which is the sort of porous boundaries, sure, no worries, lots of friends, but maybe no authority. And I think a lot of the women I work with particularly feel very much like this binary is concrete and real. And what I really wanted to do in the book was to say it's kind of in our own minds. And actually, there's a ton more different ways we could show up between those two poles, if you like, and sometimes bringing together dissonant feeling ideas like power and likability actually gives us really generative, interesting ways to show up.
Yeah, it's so easy to think about over-indexing on either one of those and becoming ineffective or not the leaders that we want to be. But I wanted to actually go back in time and just let folks know a little bit about how you came to writing this book. So you were interested in communication from a very young age, and you were a champion debater. So what got you interested in communication from the get-go, and how did that shape your journey to today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, if my parents were here, they would say I was always interested in communication. I talked a lot, really, as soon as I could. But I think the thing that made me particularly aware of the gendered nature of it for me was I was a debater from very young. I was about 10 when I started, and I was usually in very all male teams. And debate itself was pretty masculine back then anyway, very adversarial and very male dominated. And I loved it. I thought, this is fascinating. It was the one place in my life where I got to have, 8 minutes on the stage all to myself and saying my piece. But I noticed I would often get comments around, Kate, that was a little much, or that was a little aggressive, or have you considered? And the boys I was debating with and the young men as we went on were often commanded for the same type of performances, for their gravitas, for their presence, and how good they were. And so it struck me, I think I started very early to recognize what are those patterns that surround communication, and particularly of interest to me was what are the gendered patterns that surround it, and why do they exist? Why do we bear with them or subscribe to them? And what happens when we don't? And that's really been a driving theme throughout my whole career and my life, I think, since then.
One of the things that you talk about is the tendency that women have to shrink themselves to fit expectations. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think when I started particularly coaching women and whose resumes, whose LinkedIn pages would blow you away, I would do research on them before we would have a call, and then they would say things like, "Oh, I'm not really the expert, but," or "No worries if you can't." Lots of different disclaimers, caveats, minimizations, and I started to realize this wasn't just one woman; this was a pattern, and I think that it was because of a awareness, as you say, of being likable, that they wanted to sort of blunt the edge of their expertise or whatever it was, so as not to intimidate or alienate or ostracize whoever they were talking to. And I think that that's a very understandable feeling. I think most women listening would understand that. And at the same time, I realized there's a real opportunity here to find a different way. Can we say what we want to with warmth or likability or whatever the personal driver was, but not take out the legs from our argument, right? And I believe still that that's very possible. And that's what a large part of the book focuses on, is how can we maintain the parts of ourselves that are us and that feel not performative, but true to who we are. And also hold a line, prosecute an argument to the best of its ability, or to get what we deserve.
You spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley in the tech culture, which is very male dominated. Did you encounter some of these challenges related to being considered an authoritative voice, but not too much of an authority? Did any of your experiences go into this book at all?
Very much. And many of my mistakes too, Karin. I think it's important to show, we're all works in progress, right? And certainly younger in my career, that was very much the case. I think the different types of power imbalances that you can get in the Valley, there's obviously seniority. So when I was much more junior, you feel there's a really big gap between you. You're certainly not peers with, say, your CEO. But there's also like a money imbalance, right? Some of the people I worked with are billionaires, right? And so even just their chat about what they did on the weekend was very different to yours. And so when you're navigating a lot of different power imbalances and other imbalances, like you're a 45-year-old man, I'm a 25-year-old woman, we don't have a lot in common in terms of our personal lives or our weekends and things that we do. It can feel very alienating, and I think maybe even more so than a normal power relationship might. So I was always very alive to those and didn't always handle them the way, in hindsight, that I wished I did.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that, because I think mistakes really are very helpful and illustrative, and we all can see ourselves in them, I would say. And so what are some of the things that you would say are missteps, and how would you have done them differently today?
Yeah, I think the sense of, particularly in startup world where you're often younger and hired in at a higher role of seniority, I think I would have just assumed that I was needed and that I was the expert on that thing. And instead, I think I felt some of that part of my career more tentative, more deferential, more posing things as, what do you think? Rather than, this is my recommendation, right? Because all of those factors were contributing to me maybe feeling a little bit on the outer. And so had I my time again, I think I would go in and say, this is the recommendation I've made. This is why. And let's discuss, or let's see where you're at, right? Rather than, we could do this, question mark. And I think that's something that, again, comes from a little bit of trepidation and a little bit of caution, but also just inexperience and feeling like that's maybe the way that goes when those power imbalances are there. I actually think my interlocutors, my CEO, for example, would have felt much better if I had been able to demonstrate what I now call safe hands, right? Kate knows what she's doing. She's not going to drop a ball when you throw it to her. she has to optically and verbally present back to him, I got that ball. I'm not going to drop it. Or I know where we should throw the ball, right? To continue the metaphor. I think I was telling him, ball, I don't know which, I'm not sure which way to throw it. And I think I would have actually worked to calm him down and to assure him a lot more had I done that.
And you talk about this in your book, which I think is also kind of the opposite of this, where rather than questioning it, you give your opinion, but then you provide so much background material to support it that it almost muddies the message. Do you see that a lot with women where they feel like they have to justify their response to the nth degree and it ends up undercutting their authority?
Yes, I do. I think because I understand the impulse entirely, and I have done it myself, which is I've done so much work on this thing, Karin. I must show it all to you.
Yes.
Right. Here are my days of research, and I've overturned every possible thing in order to get this answer to you. And the metaphor I often give my coaching clients is, it's a little bit like someone coming to you and showing you a double page of Where's Waldo and walking you through every little piece of that page, right? It's overwhelming and there's a lot. Really, as an executive, I just want to know you found Waldo, right? And if I have questions about how you did that, I will ask. But oftentimes we forget that we end this long paragraph with, by the way, I found Waldo. And actually executives would prefer us to say, top line, I found Waldo. This is the world in which he's living on this page. And, here are my observations, or here's how I think we should move forward. And when you think about inverting that pyramid, if you like, oftentimes other people around you have a lot more confidence in the way you've approached the problem. And also they can just keep track, right? It's very human to lose the thread sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do a lot of work in executive presence, and this is precisely what I teach. Front load the most important information, and then you can give some supporting details, but let questions dictate where you take a deeper dive. Don't try to give all the information you could possibly tell about it, because they don't have time for it, and they probably don't want to hear every nuance. But just tell them the top line, and then allow them to guide you as to where they want more information. So I think
exactly. Yes.
And to that point, the one other thing, as I was reading the book, I'm like, some of this, a lot of it is gender specific. This is, but there also seem to be a lot of lessons that could be applied to men as well. Do you consider?
Yes, in fact, I have had a lot of men email me, and my Amazon reviews have a lot of men saying, as a man, this book was very helpful, which was very gratifying. I would say most of it is very applicable to men, or if you're interested in how to communicate, with more impact and influence, that's for sure something that I think is very useful. I wrote it for women only because that was my experience. And I do think there are particular tightropes that we alone do walk. And I wanted to give airtime to those as well.
No, I think that's a great idea. Let's talk a little bit about one of the phrases that you coined that I really like. You call it imposing syndrome as opposed to imposter syndrome. What do you mean by imposing syndrome?
Yes, I think we sort of touched on this with the idea of minimizing ourselves or shrinking ourselves, which is, I think women have a cultural bias to not wanting to be an imposition, right? We fix problems, we don't make them. And even if you think about the AI voices are always default woman, right? We answer, we don't make and ask. And I think that's a really deep thing with women. I have so many women clients who say to me things like, well, I'm a people pleaser, or I'm really bad at asking for help. And these are sometimes even worn as badges of honor, right? Like this is how I show up in the world. And actually a lot of work is about making asks. You're asking for time, for resources, for energy behind a project, right? For a team to staff something up. And when we fear that imposition, that's where I think that shrinking language comes in. We say, oh, it'll just take 2 seconds. It won't take long. And actually it might take long, right? It might take the full hour or a couple hours because it's worthy of that. And you are worthy of that. So I often call it imposing syndrome as a little bit of a nod to this is something that repeats. It's common. It's around us. But once you start seeing that pattern, you can start realizing, I'm feeling a little bit awkward maybe about making this request, how might I frame it and phrase it such that both it's doing justice to me, but also the other person is hearing the importance of what I'm asking. If I said to you, Karin, it'll just take 2 seconds, you would probably think, well, it mustn't be that important, right? It's administrative perhaps. Whereas if I said, hey, I really love to talk to you about our Q4 estimates. I'm going to put an hour in with you next week. Feel free to move that around if it doesn't suit you. Suddenly you're thinking of me and that meeting in a really different way. So I think giving the substance where it's due is really important.
Yeah. And importantly, you're putting it within the context of the business as a whole. This is important to the business as a whole. It's not, necessarily like I am valuable, just me unto myself. It is the information that I'm providing to you that is critical for the success of the enterprise as a whole. And I think that is a reframing that a lot of us struggle with. And yes. I think you were wise to point that out. One thing I did want to talk about was your section that you call Kill Your Confidence. Can you unpack what that looks like?
I know, counterintuitive from me, right?
Right. Kill your confidence.
I'm being a little bit cheeky in the title, but what I'm really pushing against, I suppose, is that I think a lot of people, I'm sure you see this in your work too, they come to you saying, I need to work on my confidence, or I've been told I need to work on my confidence. And what happens when we hear that phrase, which is, by the way, not bad to tell somebody, we become very, very self-conscious. We self-surveil to, I think, a disabling amount. We become almost paralyzed. Did that sound confident? Did I look confident? Is my blazer confident? And it kind of becomes this open tab that drains from, our primary tab that we're in that interaction. And what I like to think about is, how do I close as many of those other distracting tabs as I can, such that I'm fully present in our interaction? And I think confidence, thinking through the realm of confidence, or the lens of confidence, is distracting and sometimes somewhat disabling. So I focus instead, actually doing the thing is where confidence will come from. So thinking about it as a verb. So can I connect really well with my interlocutor, right? Am I present and actually here? And can I somehow be of service to them? Like, what do they actually need? And I don't mean office admin, like getting them a coffee, but I more mean like, oh, what are they worried about? What could I work on that would directly solve something that they are staying up late worrying about? Is it helpful, executive, if I pulled together, a list of A, B, and C for us to focus on that for next week, right? And seeing if they say, oh yeah, actually that would be great. I really, that's something I've been meaning to do, and then being actually helping them, or involved in helping them. Being present and being helpful actually illustrate confidence. Yes. But we're not sort of hung up on thinking about, is it confident? Am I doing it? So that's where I ask people to shift. And in my work, I've seen a lot of real success with that, where it takes us somewhat of the burden off and shifts it back into their actual expertise, which is where it should be in the first instance, I think.
Right. Like, I'm confident in the things that I do know, but I'm also confident that I don't know a lot. Right. That's why I love having people in my network who are excellent at other areas that I can be like, okay, talk to them. Like, they're really good at this stuff.
Absolutely.
But let's talk a little bit about a phenomenon that I run into a lot. So I do a lot of work in virtual presence. And one of the standard comments that I get from women that I work with is, oh, I don't want to turn my camera on because I'm not camera ready. The men I work with typically have no problem turning their camera on, even if I'm like, did you look at yourself? Like, you're in shadow, you're halfway off the screen. Like, do you feel like that is something that kind of falls under this category of powerfully likable? Like, we want to show up looking like a news anchor per se. Like, why do we do that to ourselves? Because to me, like, in my brain, I'm like, you turn on your camera so that you can communicate in full. It's not about showing up looking perfect. It's showing up in a way so that you are in the richest medium possible that technology allows. But is it falling under that umbrella that you were talking about?
It might do. That's a really interesting point. I hadn't touched on camera off in my book. And I honestly, I've been on so many webinars of late where it's all cameras off, and it's very disorienting as a speaker, right? Because I can't tell who's resonating and where you're at. So yes, I think it is. If you're worried about it, I mean, for one, I would say if it's a one-off, like I'm very ill, but I wanted to make this call and I'm very self-conscious, that's fine, right? Let's put that in a separate.
No one wants to see you eating on camera, right?
Exactly, right? We can make a separate category for those things. But I think generally, yes, make sure that you have a comfortable space, that you're not worried about someone walking in on the background or all the things that sometimes do make us hesitant to turn on the camera. Make sure that your lighting is fine. If you know that going into it, I think showing up however you are that day is actually so much better than not putting on the camera. And I say this, as you know, of someone who does tend to get up very early for my calls. And I'm not always made up. I'm not always, I haven't always been up for 5 hours before that call. And I think it's still really, really important. So where you can and where it's in your aegis to do so, I think it's so helpful to your connection with whoever you're speaking with.
Yeah, I always say you can't own the room if you can't be seen in the room. And if you have your camera off, you are not being seen in the virtual room. But let's actually kind of connect that to another chapter where you talk all about the importance of voice and physicality. How are those so important for how women are perceived?
Yeah, I think it's funny when I say this, I see women sort of tense their shoulders and get worried saying, is she going to tell me to speak in a lower register or all the things that I think are out there and I think are very dangerous, actually.
Yes, I agree.
So it's actually much more about what's the energy that you're bringing with your voice and your physicality, right? Are you looking checked out? Are you sounding bored? Are you kind of halfway out the room? All of these things can really connect and project to the way in which we're communicating. And I think I often say that really good communicators impart information, and that's wonderful, but gifted communicators can actually change the room that they're in. We can bring a voice or a physicality. And I don't mean performatively, right? Like being this strange robot that is not like yourself. But when we've decided, I have a lot of energy. There's a lot of blood going to this thing that I'm working on and I want to show that off. It's often very, very infectious. And I think being mindful or strategic maybe about how I'm going to show up, strategically deciding to do something for my communication is very, very powerful. And I say that with a very strong, perhaps feminist knowledge that I don't want to tell anybody to smile more or to speak deeper or to all the things that I think we're told, but understand that they all have strategic value. Smiling to encourage connection, for example, which I talk about in the book, is actually a very strategic thing to do. Smiling to an audience is more likely to make them smile back at you, which is more likely to make you feel more comfortable as a speaker. There's strategy behind some of these things that I think is wise to at least experiment with. And if it doesn't serve you, that's fine. But I think as somebody who used to present to audiences when I was very young, with what I call my resting, concentrating face, I was very, very serious and really in my head about what argument I was going to deliver. I was met with an audience of very stone-faced, serious people, right? Because we take our cues from a speaker. And so that was not helpful. That was a very intimidating crowd to speak to. Now I know when I'm talking when and how to smile to elicit a very friendly feeling crowd back to me. And that's a very different interaction in terms of voice and physicality.
Yeah, it has to come from a place of authenticity. I was working with one of my first clients was asking for my help in how she was coming across on video. She didn't like how she was coming across. And she said, every time I do my video right beforehand, they say smile. And she was not somebody who was a smiley person by nature. She was a double PhD, brilliant woman. Yes. And when she would be told to smile, she kind of did this kind of smirky sort of thing. But it came across as so inauthentic and uncomfortable. Yes. And And it enraged me because I thought, I bet they do not say that to all of the
men.
male executives in this organization, and it ticked me off. But
Yeah.
it didn't work for her because, well, for one thing, what she was talking about wasn't smiley, and also it didn't feel comfortable to her. Now,
Right.
what I told her to do is like speak with conviction, and then allow that to show on your face, and that's going to resonate with your audience. So I absolutely agree with that. But let's actually take a deeper dive on the idea of lowering your voice, because I do have this question brought to me a lot. Karin, how can I lower my voice so I sound more authoritative? I'm not going to give my opinion. I want to hear yours. What do you tell people whenever they ask you the same?
So it's so interesting how much that comes up to me as well. And it's just, we encode authority as masculine. Right. That's what the premise of the question says, which is in order to access that, I need to masculinize. And as someone who debated, and I over masculinized, I over feminized, I went everywhere on that spectrum, trying to find a place that I thought was more impactful or more powerful. And trust me, it's weird to try to be very, very different. And it's importantly exhausting, because it was not me, and it was not the way that I naturally like to show up. So I'm very much of the opinion that if you have a higher feminine voice, this is my normal voice, by the way, this is my normal register. I work with a lot of people who say, oh, I fear that my voice is almost baby-like or childlike, are the words I hear. And I say, that is your voice. So what we need to do is encode authority in other ways that feel like you, and it's not going to be vocal. That's okay. There is nothing worse, I think, than trying to think I need to actually now put on my a different self. And I often talk about how the delta between our real self, if you can have one of those in our normal life, and our professional self really shouldn't be very big. The only difference is that it's maybe more engaged or a bit more activated if you're speaking to a bigger group than you would, one-on-one in your personal life. But really the personality, the feeling that we're getting from you should be the same. And so I'm very much in the please don't decide to go baritone if that's not your normal vibe.
Absolutely. If you're a soprano, just lean into that. I totally agree. So I was actually talking about you earlier today. So I don't know if you're probably sleeping at the time, but I was talking to someone who is from a different generation than I am, a young lady who was beginning her career. And I said, and she was talking about the podcast. I'm like, you're going to love this episode that I'm about to record with Dr. Kate Mason about how to speak effectively as a woman. And that made me consider the question, is this book going to be read differently by different generations, like how they perceive it? Do you see a shift based upon what generation somebody's from?
Yes, I do. It's really fascinating. I'm very bad at knowing which generation I am, but I think I am an elder millennial. I may be cuspy. But I do find my generation and above are like, oh, this is the sort of book I wished I had, which is certainly how I wished I had it in my 20s, or known these things. I find hearteningly some of the younger generation are like, yeah, obviously. Of course I wouldn't change my voice, and I'm thrilled when I hear that, because I think we are slowly acculturating folks to seeing women as authoritative, to seeing women in positions of power. And the thing I'm reminded of in that shift is that women in the workplace is still a relatively new phenomenon, right? We have not, and really, I suppose men in a modern workplace is still a relatively new phenomenon. So in many ways, we have to reestablish what those norms and boundaries will look like. And in some ways, I hope this book will be entirely irrelevant one day, that it won't even be a question, that of course I'm showing up as myself. But until then, I really wanted a way to just have a bit of a cheat code, or something you could have on your bookcase and bring down when you were feeling like you needed a little bit of buttressing or supporting before an important moment.
One thing I do want to touch upon with you and get your opinion on is the idea of showing up as your whole self. Is there a danger in showing up as your whole self? What would you caution people to think about?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I've had some funny conversations with managers recently who have much younger people entering the workforce. And they're like, this feels like a fraught phrase because I'm saying things like bring your whole self to work and they're bringing too much, right? I'm hearing about things on the weekend that really I should not be hearing about. And I tend to think, certainly I think the initiation of that phrase tended to be around like maybe if you were LGBTQ and you could turn up as your true self, right? You could say my wife if you were a woman, etc. And I think those things are profoundly important to giving us a sense of stability and to feel known and seen about oneself. To be able to say offhandedly, you know, my partner this or my children that, I think is really important. I think is the danger of that phrase, as you say, the sort of can it go too far, is probably in the realm of like sharing too much information, or that's actually uncomfortable for other people to know that maybe you had a very successful weekend with the ladies. Right. That's maybe something that's not entirely work appropriate. And so I think the boundaries may blur and they'll be very context dependent and workplace dependent. So there's a little bit of personal judgment and wisdom there as to when to deploy those things. But I'm much more of a knowing about myself is important, but maybe knowing too much can be a little bit inappropriate, or even at times just kind of suck the energy out of the room. I'm working with someone at the moment, and he shared with me some recorded Zooms with his team, one-on-ones, with permission with everybody involved.
Sure.
And I noticed he started every call saying how exhausted he was. And he's the manager.
No.
And I thought that was so interesting because, again, he's trying to, quote, bring his whole self to work. But actually what it did was just, as you can imagine, sucked all of the air out of those interactions. Yeah. Right. And often in these high performance cultures, being tired is kind of table stakes. Like we're all tired. Right. So I've suggested to him, you know, hey, maybe beginning those calls, even if you are tired, beginning those calls with like, hey, how are you? What's happening? Or here's a fun thing I did on my weekend, or whatever you're trying to build rapport about. But maybe hiding that I'm so tired does better service to the rapport and the connection that you might have in that meeting. So just thinking strategically again about when and why you might share. It doesn't mean you're not tired. It doesn't mean you can't tell your friends you're tired, but maybe in that moment there's a reason to not burden everybody else with it.
I love that. And yeah, I would have counseled the same thing. As soon as you said, I'm like, oh, ouch, take that back. Right. So this has flown by. We're a little bit over the half hour, but it's been a great conversation. But I always like to leave our listeners with one big takeaway, one big idea to think about. And if you don't mind, I'd like to shape your answer a little bit because I would love to help people to make one change now that will have significant dividends. So what is, because these are probably lifelong habits that we have to shift. So what is the one thing that you think, okay, if there's anything that you can change, do this? And it doesn't have to be massive, but like, what's one thing that you would suggest people do?
So
Women.
My answer is going to be, a little bit longer than just one thing, but it is one thing, which is take an inventory of yourself. And what I mean by that is over a week, write down, where are you getting energy? Where are those interactions and moments that you think, oh, I was really myself. This worked really well for me. I felt good after that interaction. And similarly, where are the ones that you're feeling drained? You get off that call or out of that interaction and think, oh, that was really hard work. And I think just honestly taking an inventory of that is a really helpful exercise to understand, where can I shape more of my world and lean into more of those moments where I am myself? And what are the things where I'm struggling with, and might I want to get some support or some help on diving deeper into how to support myself in those? So do an inventory. It sounds boring, but it's actually very revealing to us with how we're communicating, how we're showing up. And I think it'll pay dividends.
I love it. Thank you so much. Dr. Kate Mason, congratulations on putting out into the world a fantastic book, Powerfully Likeable. I suggest all women pick it up, but actually men should pick it up as well, because there's so many gems that you can get in its pages. So thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Karin. I loved every second.
I knew my conversation with Kate was going to go long because we had so much to talk about and there was still more that we had to say, but it could not fit. So that's why I'm excited to tell you about this week's bonus content. So we talk about in this mini episode certain circumstances where it actually is a superpower to be a woman when you're communicating. So we discuss when that might be something that is an advantage versus something that you need to, rethink and perhaps reshape. So if you are interested in listening to that conversation, I would encourage you to go to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content, speakerdynamics.com/bonus content to hear us talk about when communicating as a woman is a superpower. I want to thank all of you for listening to our discussion today about communication. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I would encourage you to tell your friends, tell your colleagues, and have them check it out and have them join this community of Speaker Dynamics Own the Room. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Until next time, everybody.